The Halo universe is a very large and mysterious place, with history that goes further back than we can ever imagine. Many wars, battles, and horrific genocidal events have taken place in this time, with one event in particular having a huge imprint on the history and the future of the Halo universe, and that of course was the Forerunners and the Precursors. This is a very bittersweet time in the Halo universe, with the Forerunners almost forcing the Precursors to hand over the mantle of responsibility by committing genocidal acts on that species. However, all this time later, we've almost come around full circle. In Halo Infinite's story, the Endless was said to be worse than the Flood, bearing in mind that this is a faction that literally infects entire colonies, planets, and solar systems. Why would that ever be the case? Well, in this video, I think I know why the Endless are worse than the Flood. We've discussed this before on the channel, but I think more of an up-to-date view now of replaying the Halo Infinite campaign and having another thought about it. I think I've got a pretty good explanation as to why I think that's the case. We always hear at the end of the campaign in the legendary ending that the Forerunners must preserve their truth, and if the Endless cannot be destroyed by Halo, it must contain them. We've got a lot to talk about in this video, but everyone, let's try to hit 100 likes in today's video. It'd be very much appreciated. I love making Halo content, and I know that everyone watching loves it as well. From my previous Halo days, we obviously stopped because of the very slow churn out of content and lore from Halo, but I'm very much looking forward to getting back into it when there's a new Halo game on the horizon. But without further ado, everyone, let's jump straight into this video. First of all, I want to provide a bit of lore around the Precursors, because it's really important to understand what happened to them and how the Flood and the Primordial formed and became what they are. Again, guys, as I mentioned, if you already know the story about the Primordial, the Precursors, and the Flood, then of course feel free to skip this part, but again, if you don't, this is really imperative to understand what's going on for the story. The Precursors were an advanced race that preceded and were mythologized by the Forerunners. The Forerunners classified them as transcendent beings, having the ability to travel amongst galaxies and accelerate the evolution of intelligent life. The Precursors were responsible for seeding the Milky Way with life, creating the galaxy's diverse compositions and species to become new tools and companions, and engineered millions of solar systems. Over time, they would also judge whether a species was worthy of the mantle, their assumed role of guardianship of all life. The humanoid species native to the world of Jabaub, who would come to be known as the Forerunners. Originally created by the Precursors to serve as their assistants and adjustants, the Forerunners were eventually judged to be unworthy of taking on the mantle and were planned to be wiped out. And the Precursors instead decided that the responsibility would fall on the shoulders of another of their creations, a collection of species referred to as humanity. During the Forerunners expedition on Path Ketona, where they encountered their creators, Forerunners accidentally found out about this genocidal plan around 10 million BCE. The Forerunners decided to prevent such fate and furiously retaliated against their creators and drove them to near extinction, first in the Milky Way and eventually in the satellite galaxy of Path Ketona. Only a small number managed to escape the Forerunners' campaign of extermination. According to the Precursors themselves, the Forerunners struck against their creators unprovoked, while certain Forerunners who learned the truth later on insisted that Precursors had planned to wipe the Forerunners first. A few of the Precursors escaped or were spared by the Forerunners. They either went into suspended animation or became molecular dust that was meant to eventually regenerate into their past forms. However, over millions of years, the dust became defective, failing to reconstitute the Precursors and instead including madness and mutations in life forms that came in contact with it. This form would later be known as the Flood. Far from accepting failure and extinction, the Precursors viewed the Flood as the means to bring unity to the galaxy, as well as punish the Forerunners for their insolence. Vowing that none of their creators would rise against them again, the Precursors decided that all life would be deprived of free will and merged into one. In the end, the sum of the Precursors' creation would be a reflection on themselves and the suffering their creations caused them. However, not all Precursors chose to take course in this action. After the genocide, those Forerunners who refused to take part in the genocide of their creators were exiled to a planet in Path Ketona. While there, they discovered two Precursor survivors who were not as corrupt as the Primordial, but were instead of a more gentle and kind nature. The Forerunners tried to save them, but the survivors chose to die with the rest of their species. Approximately 10 million years later, After the Forerunners' genocide of the precursors, humanity's interstellar empire came into contact with the precursors' powder, which would, over several centuries, bring forth the Flood. The Flood initially ravaged humanity's colonies, until receding from the galaxy on its own accord, awaiting for a better moment to exact their final vengeance on the Forerunners. The Flood intentionally allowed some humans to go uninfected, leaving the implication of a possible cure that would misdirect efforts into its next assault. Around the same time, a human exploratory group discovered a small planetoid at the edge of the Milky Way, hidden within its large stasis capsule containing an ancient being who they later named the Primordial. In fact, the last intact precursor mutated to survive the passage of eons. The group transported the capsule and of course its captive to the human capital world of Sharam Hakor, and found a way to communicate with the being, which claimed to be the last precursor. The human scientists began questioning the Primordial, almost interrogating it. And when the human scientists questioned the imprisoned being as to the nature of the Flood, the Primordial's responses were so horrifying that many of them committed suicide. Around 10,000 years later, the Isodidact interrogated the Primordial on Installation 07, receiving only vague responses as to the fate of the precursors and the relationship with the Flood. Of course, enraged by this, the Isodidact then executed the being. The Primordial faced its end with calm satisfaction, stating that the Forerunners' defiance and, indeed, its own death through the artificial passing of 1 billion years within an accelerating chronological field would only add up to its total sweetness of life's struggles, while asserting its confidence that all life will still succumb to the Flood in the end. The Didacts later discovered that the Gravemind retained the thoughts and the memories of the Primordial. Before its demise, the being had transferred its consciousness into the Flood's compound mind. However, not even the Gravemind could successfully access or comprehend the wisdom the precursors once had, flawed and fallen as it was. So that's a bit of background on the precursors, the Primordial, and of course the Flood as well, and on Zeta Halo. Now, let's talk about some theories. It was mentioned that the Endless had survived the firing of the Halo arrays, which to myself and to a lot of people is extremely difficult to wrap their heads around. The firing of the Halo ring, let alone the entire Halo array at the time, should wipe out all sentient life within its blast radius. How could a species survive this? Well, as we've spoken about in our lore recap, after the Flood Forerunner War, the Isodidact had visited the Primordial and of course began interrogating it in a way, trying to finish what Mendicant Bias had started. However, during this interrogation process, the Primordial would only give very vague responses, not giving away anything to the Isodidact. The Isodidact was enraged by the Primordial's inability to share information, so he made the decision to execute the Primordial. The Primordial was killed by being placed into something called an accelerating chronological field, which is essentially a time lock. No time passes for the occupant, whilst eons may transpire in normal space. Such a field occupies a fractional dimension slip space and protects its contents from all damage inflicted from outside of that field, even from the Halo arrays. Any incoming energy is reflected by the fractional dimension and scattered in the field surroundings as thermal energy and high energy radiation. This was used for the Primordial's body to decompose, however its mind still being intact. It then of course transferred its consciousness into the Flood's compound mind, and of course that was the origin of the Gravemind. In addition to the ability to manipulate time, slipspace bubbles allow the compression of immense masses and volumes into a comparatively tiny space. Now, this is where things get super interesting. Of course, in the description we read earlier on in the video, this part was also mentioned. A human exploratory group discovered a small planetoid at the edge of the Milky Way. Hidden within was a large stasis capsule containing an ancient being who was later named the Primordial, who was in fact the last intact precursor, mutated to survive the passage of eons. Are you guys thinking what I'm thinking right now? Are the Endless the precursors, or is there another planet somewhere on the edge of the Milky Way? Which could there be another or more Primordials out there in these stasis capsules? And it gets even more interesting than this. What does it go on to say at the end of the legendary ending? Offensive bias has been deployed. Now, why would offensive bias be deployed if the Endless are released? Now, if you guys don't know the story of Mendicant Bias, I'd really recommend going to watch my previous video to get an overview of what happened there. But in high level, Mendicant Bias was deployed to interrogate the first Primordial, of course this didn't go to plan, and of course Mendicant Bias was infected with the Logic Plague. The Forerunners would not want this to happen again if another Primordial was out there, and again the same thing could happen again. So this time around, rather than having a smarter AI like Mendicant Bias do the interrogation, why not have a more stable version of Mendicant Bias do the interrogating? Offensive Bias. I mean, we might have cracked it here. I don't really know. I'd love to know your suggestions down below on this, and potentially it was the Primordial or the Precursors that the Harbinger was speaking to at the end of the game, which is of course why the weapon was unable to establish where this connection was coming from, because it was so old. Okay, I've just thought of something really interesting. This is me editing the video at the moment, and if you guys think back to earlier on into the video when we were talking about the Precursors wanting to essentially perform genocide on the Forerunners because they were an inferior race, and they didn't really match up to the mantle. Well, one of my suggestions and one of the things I've just thought about was that maybe the Forerunners know exactly what the Endless are, and potentially they are Precursors. And of course, if they get free, they're of course going to try and eliminate all of those that are an inferior race. So that could be humanity, that could be the Forerunners, and that could be all of the other species in the galaxy. So of course when the Grand Edict is talking in the legendary trailer, he mentions that they must be contained within Halo and forgotten by time. Is this because if they get out, they're going to try and eliminate or wipe out the Forerunners and of course any other inferior species? And that's the reason why they're worse than the Flood. It's just something that I came to mind, and it makes a lot of sense really. Like the Forerunners, who of course the Grand Edict is a Forerunner, is of course against the Precursors or the Primordial or the Endless in this sense being let out. And not to forget as well, the Harbinger also says, the Forerunner's lies are at an end. She is the Harbinger of the truth.
The Forerunner's lies are at an end. I am the Harbinger of the truth. The Endless will be found.
Ooh.
They will ascend.
Now would be good.
I know. 3,
The Reformation begins.
2, 1, go!
Boss fight. Now, could this be because the Precursors thought that, of course, the Forerunners were an inferior race and they needed to eliminate them at the time? Because that's, of course, what their job was, essentially. If they didn't fit the description of the mantle, they were essentially gone. The Forerunners didn't fit that description, and the Forerunners battled against it, defeating the Precursors. Also, throughout the boss fight at the end, the weapon mentioned that something was helping her push back against the Harbinger. Could this have been offensive bias? And finally, the portal at the end. The Chief and the weapon were teleported 3 days into the future, but to them of course it felt like an instant. All signals and communications were cut off, and even the pilot couldn't detect where they were. Did the weapon and Chief enter a fractal dimension slipspace portal to get out of the Silent Auditorium and back onto the Zeta Halo surface? Again, we don't know who put that portal there, but potentially it could have been offensive bias, putting it to help them get out of there. But again, at this point, we really do not know. Again, there are loads of different theories and discussions that we could have around this, but again, after piecing everything together, it's extremely interesting that how these events really do piece together and just make a lot of sense. And I would love to know what you guys' thoughts and opinions are on what you think the Endless are, who you think they are, and what you think the next part of this story is going to be. But this isn't all. The Endless have been framed as worse than the Flood, as we said at the beginning of the video. Why and how? We may have touched upon it a little bit at the beginning of the video, but in the second portion of the video, this is where I want to do the most of the explaining and my theories as to why I believe that this is the case. There's a lot to unpack here, so make sure you stick around, strap in, and take a listen to this. But also, let me know your thoughts and opinions down below. Why do you think the Endless are worse than the Flood? What could they have done to possibly warrant that? Let's have a listen. Okay, so to actually begin explaining this, we need to start at the end of the Halo Infinite campaign, at the legendary ending. The two characters speaking are the Grand Edict and Despondent Pyre. This conversation took place just after the Flood Forerunner War, whereby the Halo Array was fired in order to contain the Flood outbreak in the universe, led by the Primordial and, of course, Mendicant Bias. Once the new council was formed, the Forerunners stumbled upon a new species that they'd never encountered before, alive and well right after the firing of the Halo rings. After first encountering and then of course going on to interrogate and speak with this species that are better known as Xalanin, they found that they had somehow survived the blast of the Halo Array and were just perplexed. The species believed that at the time, the Forerunners were there to help them on the planet. However, much to the Forerunners' confusion, they returned to Maethrillion to discuss this new species and the ways they believed that they could survive such a blast. No common denominator within the meeting was drawn, and the new council were just perplexed at the time. Now guys, I've done loads and loads of videos on the ways that I believe that the Endless actually survived the Halo Rings blast, so if you guys want to go check those out, I'll leave 1 or 2 of them in the link down in the description down below also. And there's also a couple of theories in there as how the Harbinger actually teleports from one place to another, and if time travel in Halo is actually a thing. So go check it out if you want to know more around that. It's really interesting to understand the lore around that too. Parley was organised between the installation's monitors and the new council to discuss the plan of action. Days later, after the monitors had returned to their installations, the Grand Edict, aka the new council, entered Zeta Halo's atmosphere and began conversing with Despondent Pyre around the new council's decision. This is of course where the discussion around the Endless's containment went on and took place, again basically what happened in the legendary ending. The Endless was sentenced to containment within Zeta Halo for examination and investigation. The Forerunners need to understand how they survived this blast. Halo Ring's firing is supposed to cleanse the galaxy, and if that now doesn't work for a species, what is its overall purpose anyway? It doesn't do what it says on the tin, which means that it's not working effectively. Once they find out their secrets and understand how they did survive, they can then make the relevant changes to ensure that they're also wiped out in the event of a Halo Ring firing to again prevent the flood from spreading. Now that we know a brief history around the Endless, how they were found, and the discussions the Forerunners and Monitors were having when first discovering them, let's talk about why they're such a threat. Now, there are multiple reasons as to why the Endless are a huge threat, and I'll try and give as much backstory as possible for each one of these points, but there are 2 main reasons I wanted to discuss in this video. There could be more, and again, I may not have thought of any other additional ones, so it's really important that you guys do, if you have any other theories or any other thoughts or suggestions that I may not cover in this video, that you comment them down below, and of course we have a discussion, an open discussion with the community around why the Forerunners are so worried about the Endless and why the Endless are worse than the Flood. Leave your suggestions and theories in the comments down below. It would make for a really good discussion. Number 1, obviously, the Flood is the main one. The Flood are an infection form that spreads extremely easily. One Flood spore can actually result in an eventual gravemind. In the event of a further Flood outbreak, on a Halo Ring or another war involving the Flood, the Halo Rings are fired to wipe out all life in the galaxy to starve the Flood of their food, meaning they will eventually be killed off like the rest of the galaxy. Now, the problem the Forerunners have with the Endless is because somehow they survive this Halo Array blast and they don't understand how. So, in the event of the Halo Array or Halo Ring in general needing to be fired, there's always going to be that one source of food left in the galaxy for the Flood to infect, of course, being the Endless. Unless, of course, they're completely immune to the Flood, but I don't really know how that's possible, so we're going to leave that theory to one side. So, if the Flood infect the Endless, the firing of the Halo Rings would do nothing against them, or their primary source of food, so it would be almost useless. This is one of the biggest concerns that the Forerunners had, and one of the main reasons for imprisoning the Endless for investigation and interrogation. They've of course given Despondent Pyre the responsibility to watch over their Silexes and learn their secrets, along with further assistance from the engineers. And again, I'll leave a picture of the engineers on screen right now from ODST. Really cool little throwback there. So yeah, the Flood infecting the Endless would be a pretty catastrophic issue unless we know exactly how they survived that Halo Ring. Moving on to reason number 2, the Forerunner secrets. It's no secret, of course, that the Forerunners are not the rightful holders of the Mantle of Responsibility. Dating back to, of course, the Precursors, they were essentially the guardians of the galaxy, ensuring that not one faction can overpower the rest and become a dominating force. Whilst not allowing conflicts, they ensured that the conflict would never endanger another species. The Precursors at the time concluded that the Forerunners were dangerous and didn't fall in line with the Mantle of Responsibility. They decided that they needed to have them wiped out and had humanity do the dirty work for them. However, somehow the Forerunners came to know of the Precursors' plan accidentally, and of course they didn't stand for this. The Forerunners devised a plan to retaliate against the Precursors and wipe them out before they could do the same to them. War broke loose and the Forerunners slayed all remaining Precursors in existence, inflicting genocide upon their species, and of course retaining the mantle, believing that they were the rightful holders. On the back of this, of course, all remaining remnants of the Precursors turned into a dust-like form, so that one day they could rise again. This essence had essentially became null, and resulted in what we know as today, the Flood. However, there was one remaining Precursor which was found. This one was unlike the rest though. This Precursor was later named the Primordial. and was found in a stasis capsule on a planet on the edge of the Milky Way. The Primordial was taken in for interrogation to find out about the flood and its purpose. Its answers were so sinister, it sent scientists insane, leading them to eventually take their own life, because they didn't want to go through the process of being turned into a flood combat form. If you guys want to know more about Mendican Bias and his story with the Primordial, I will link a video in the description down below so you can listen to it in full detail. It's such a fucking cool story. My favourite story in the Halo lore, and I really recommend you guys going to watch it and listen to it if you don't know about it already. Really interesting, and actually links into Halo Infinite a little bit, so yes, worth noting and worth finding out about. But why am I telling you this information? What does this have to do with anything? Well, it's believed and theorised that the Harbinger in-game is in fact a part of the Endless, and that the Harbinger is the remnants of the Precursors. She always mentions about the Forerunners' lies, and that they're now at an end. How the Endless stood and watched as they were falsely imprisoned and accused in the Silent Auditorium. The only lies in the canon that really make sense is that the rightful holders of the mantle are not the Forerunners, and again, it's the Precursors. The Forerunners passed the mantle down to humanity, better known as Reclaimers, and of course this is why only Reclaimers can access Forerunner technology, like opening Silexes or activating Halo rings. The Harbinger says, "We are not enemies. I know of you, Reclaimer, but hear this. You are not the future," stating that the Reclaimers should not hold the mantle, and that they're not the species that can take the universe in the right direction. And that all, of course, stemmed from the lies of the Forerunners. The Forerunners are not the rightful holders of the mantle, and it was the Precursors, and again, it would have been like an evolution of the Precursors when they eventually died out. And of course, humanity slayed them, inflicted genocide on their species, and of course taking it for themselves. There are of course the two main reasons for it, and yeah, they both make a lot of sense. Of course the flood one is probably more realistic. Again, they don't know how they survived it, so if they did survive, then of course if they're infected by the flood, that of course means that they're basically got an unlimited source of food, and again, no matter what they do, they can't die. But again, going into the lore of the game and more of the canon, looking at what the Harbinger says, and again, it does make a lot of sense and goes back to the Forerunners around the mantle and around the Precursors as well. So even at the end of the game, she was talking to someone, but the connection was extremely old. I'm thinking maybe she was speaking to or communicating with some form of precursor, or even some remnants of a precursor. Could even be the Gravemind. So guys, make sure you leave your comments and theories down below. It'd be really interesting to understand what you guys think about this as well, because for me, I personally think that somehow the Flood are still related to this, and potentially it's the Gravemind, or even some remnants of a precursor that the Harbinger was communicating with as well. But again, really interesting to think about. But of course, overall, I think these are the two main reasons why the Forerunners are so worried about the Endless. And of course, Mendican Bias turned on the Forerunners after learning about the Precursors and their plans. Maybe the Forerunners think that other monitors and AIs on other installations would do the same if their secret was out. Very interesting, but again, guys, let me know what you think down below in the comment section. Be really interested to know your thoughts and theories around this as well. And again, if the AIs and monitors of different installations knew about the Forerunners' lies, do you think they would have stuck with them as long as that they have? I mean, we don't know at this point. But again, something really interesting to have a little think about. But everyone, that's going to be it for today's video. There's a lot to unpack here, a lot of information to ponder over, to leave your theories down below. What do you think is going on here? I personally think that the Endless are able to control and manipulate time. They use something or have the ability or power, like the Harbinger does when she's battling the Chief and moving from different points in time, and they time travelled after the firing of the Halo ring, after they had word that it was going to happen. Whether that's an insider Forerunner which was communicating with them, whether it was someone ancient that was telling them what was happening and gave them the ability to be able to use a time lock, or to just have the ability and the power to teleport from there and then. Whatever it might be, I think that the Endless have the ability to be able to do that. They're not immune to the ring as such, or the ring's blast, because I don't think any species in the universe, the galaxy, would be immune to that. I think it is the ability, they've just avoided it by using some form of time lock or teleportation method to move forward in time to prevent the Halo ring's firing from affecting them, essentially. And I think that's where the Forerunners are very very worried. This is of course why the Grand Edict and other Forerunners, after their parley with Despondent Pyre and things along those lines on Zeta Halo, wanted the Endless to be studied, to hopefully potentially learn the power for themselves and have the upper hand over the different factions in the universe, because if they can survive the Halo Ring blasts like the Endless did, then they wouldn't need to have to rebuild or anything along those lines like they have done before. But then this also means that if other factions in the universe, the Covenant, the Banished, the Flood, whatever it might be, then know how to do this, they know that there is a possibility of surviving the Halo Array blasts, they're going to manipulate this and try to gain access to them as well. And if they can get the Endless on side, well, they're going to survive all of the Halo Array blasts, and it's pointless. I think this is why the Forerunners imprisoned the Endless. They need to understand and to learn how they manipulate time. They need to understand how they survived the blast of the Halo Array, because if they don't understand that and another faction does, then they've got a massive advantage. They're going to be on top of all future wars. Nothing is going to be able to stop them. So they're going to want to fire the Halo Ring, kill every other faction, being, and life form, whilst they're still alive, because they know how to avoid it. Do you know what I'm trying to say? So I think that is the reasons why the Endless were imprisoned by the Forerunners, to preserve their truth and to understand how it happened. And of course, potentially, if the Endless are precursor of Origin, which we do believe they will be, and they are, as we mentioned in the video, then they're going to know that the Forerunners committed genocide upon the precursors, and of course that's another reason as to why they need to preserve their truth there as well. But there's a lot to unpack here. Let me know your thoughts and opinions down below. I would love to know what you think. No theory is a stupid one or a crazy one. As a community, we've always enjoyed listening and reading through these theories. But I hope you have enjoyed, everyone. If you have, leave a like. It'd be very much appreciated. Subscribe to the channel for more content coming. Not just Halo, but every other game story-based content there is. And guys, speak soon and take care.